I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
So Ruth Lawrence is going to serve 2 life sentences for her role in the brutal murder of 2 men 11 years ago. And we heard yesterday, I suppose, the human impact of these crimes as the victims' families spoke both in court and outside court. And I suppose one of bit that kind of sums it up is where Anthony Keegan's, one of his relatives, described how Ruth Lawrence had an email called the root of all evil. And I suppose that's how they see this person who took the lives of their loved ones.
Yeah, so Anthony Keegan, who would have been Eoin O'Connor's best friend, so his sister Margaret Keenan, she actually gave evidence as well during the trial herself, and she was there pretty much every day for the 5 weeks that it went on. And so she was one of 4 people who made victim impact statements, like in the kind of the formal court sitting, where before Ruth Lawrence was, formally given her life sentence. I mean, there was never going to be any other sentence given. Like, there was no surprise there. But speaking outside to journalists, she really brought home the kind of the devastation that has been visited upon both families, and how it was a cold, callous, calculated murder, and that's how she described, in those words, that's how she described Ruth Lawrence. She mentioned like the fact that Ruth Lawrence, at a time when she could have been helping the guards and coming home and confessing instead of adding to the family's pain. She was in South Africa working as a tutu artist. She had changed her name to Lawless, which suggested an element of I suppose gloating in the fact,
or bravado or something. Yeah, and
the idea of using an email, the root of all evil, again was a play on the word root and Ruth. Yeah, again didn't show there was no sense of comfort there for the family.
Because at this stage, even when she's in South Africa, I mean, everybody knows that she's a suspect. It's been highlighted, so it's not as if she's shocked a couple of years later when she's facing extradition. I mean, she's being described, maybe not named, probably is even being named at this stage, but certainly everybody knows that she is the prime suspect.
I mean, there were prime suspects from the Friday after it. Yeah. Like, a week after Good Friday in April 2014, they had already gone to London, and they were prime suspects at that stage. And I suppose one of the kind of remarks that Margaret also made is that she said she saw online a tattoo of a man's head with what looked like a bullet wound in it and blood in his face, and wondered, was this Anthony or Eoin? So there was a sense of, not only did Ruth Lawrence take these men's lives and put the family through the trauma they did, but also
reveled in it almost.
And reveled in it. And, and there's no real extra punishment for that. So there was a real sense of hurt there, and they both her and Eoin O'Connor's partner Karen Roach mentioned about listening in evidence about how Ruth laughed afterwards, and Margaret again in her statement outside the court, she said, laughing that my brother died for his friend was the definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing, because she went on to work for the CRC church in South Africa. This is Ruth, so they kind of see this as somebody who was who never came clean, and who was hiding her true nature. And she says, not in 11 years did she give us a bit of peace. She went on living her life while we were living in hell, not knowing what happened to our loved ones. And they said it was very much by the grace of God that they got her back, considering that she had run to a country where there isn't an extradition agreement with Ireland. And that said, while it won't bring them back, it will allow the families to take a step at least towards grief rather than anger. So they'll hopefully move on to some extent in whatever stage of grief that they're still dealing with. But they do talk about like the impact on their own families, and there was statements as well as Karen Roach, who was Owen's partner, but also from his 2 daughters. Now one of them is Brooke Roach. She's now 21. And she laughed when she was told that her father had gone missing, because she was only 10. She thought only kids went missing. And that every time the front door opened thereafter, she thought, it was him coming in.
And she also makes an interesting point, which is she does address obviously what's behind all of this. This is, they were killed, those men, because they'd been attempting to collect money, ultimately, or that's the genesis of it. And behind that was the drugs trade. And Brooke wrote it RTE report that she says she does address that directly in saying selling drugs is no reason to die, for somebody to be killed for something like that. Which I suppose goes to the heart of this case. Now Ruth Lawrence, she's one of very few people, one of very few women to be convicted of a role in a gangland murder in this state. I mean, it's highly rare.
No, it is unusual. I mean, there's less than 20 women serving life for murder. Of course, you'd have Regina Keogh, who's serving life for her role in the murder of Gareth Hutch. That was part of the Hutch-Kinahan feud, and she certainly wasn't the trigger person or anything like that. She was. Her part, I suppose, was organising an apartment for the gunmen to use. And I think there was commentary about that at the time, that she was unlucky that she was charged with murder and convicted of it. And of course, then you'd have Rose Lynch, who was part of a dissident gang that they shot the wrong guy. They shot an innocent van driver in Ballyfermot in what they thought was revenge for an attack on a continuity IRA man. Rose Lynch, I think, is getting close to being one of the longest serving lifers female lifers in the Irish prison system at the minute. But
so it's very uncommon, I suppose. And like Ruth Lawrence, I mean, do we get a sense of, what sort of person she is through all this trial? Obviously, she never spoke at any time. She certainly we didn't hear any evidence about her background or any sort of anything that would have led her to get involved in something as violent and horrific as this.
No, I mean, look, from, certainly what the family have picked out from it is that Ruth Lawrence is a very cold, calculating person who shows no remorse whatsoever.
Yeah.
Her own counsel defending her, Patrick Gageby, like he told the trial judge he was handing in a bundle of certificates into court to show that his client had made good use of her time in custody.
Yeah.
And we had a little bit of character reference during the trial itself from two pastors from the CRC church who said that she was great in helping feed people and, working in a shelter of people who were in danger of trafficking. And that, she was great while she was in Durban and then went back to Bloemfontein and vice versa.
Yeah.
But there was nothing about her. Like, we do know that she went to school in North Dublin. She's originally from Clontarf. She trained at some point as a tattoo artist and apparently was very good when she was working in South Africa. She was in demand. There was we did hear from a journalistic colleague in South Africa, that she was making something like €250 a day, which is big money in South Africa.
Yeah.
It's a much poorer country than Ireland, and to be making that kind of money was pretty good. That she was in demand, she was very good at it. When you look at what Margaret Keenan was saying in her victim impact statements, that you do wonder about her true nature. That they talked about the absolute chaos the family were going through. There were people who were travelling from the family were travelling to Cavan each day. They were searching through fields and boglands looking for two dead bodies, and they couldn't make sense of the effort that was put into the disposal of the bodies. Like, their shoes and socks were missing. Why were coal bags used? And the idea that they were thinking about trying to weigh down the bodies and dump them in the lake kind of added to it as well.
So if you go back to the crime itself, Eamon, like, it's not there's a degree of planning. There's they travel to get a weapon. They obviously dispose of the body. They plan that as well. It's not it couldn't be characterized as an impulsive kill. And while they are obviously the men are looking to get money off them, they're not necessarily under a death threat. Ruth Lawrence and her boyfriend at the time.
No, not at all. And I mean, somebody shouted from the body of the court yesterday, "Tell the truth" at her. So I mean, there's certainly a sense that not everything was heard in court, and there were kind of. For instance, there was a recording of a phone call to the 999 number, the emergency number, where a man with a strong Dublin accent was trying to tell the guards there was two bodies in the field in Dublin. And that was never really explained in court what that was about. And there is a sense that, while Eoin O'Connor was the guy, according to the state, who was selling the drugs to Jay Symes, who was the key state witness, and to Neville van de Westhuizen, who was Ruth Lawrence's partner, who was also wanted in Ireland to face, the murder charges as well. there was no sense of who Eoin O'Connor was working for. I mean, we did hear, there was reference to another person. There was restrictions on allowing him being named. But even with that, there was no great, it wasn't clear what everybody's role was, higher above pecking order, where Eoin O'Connor was. I mean, he was very much, I suppose, a courier in the business. He certainly, there was no sense of this is a man making, a huge amount of money. This wasn't somebody who was taking, the flights to the sunshine holiday resorts and bringing all these extended family over, wearing Rolex watches, the usual stuff that we see in some of the cab cases, that this was very much a low-level operator, but at the same time, still an operator for, some part of a drug dealing network, which cost him his life. Which was probably based in North Dublin, we believe, and probably a more serious sort of operation above him. But there was no sense that Ruth Lawrence was under some sort of threat that she had to kill or be killed. I mean, there's nobody is sort of suggesting that. Obviously, there was at times, she was described by one of the state witnesses, Stacey Science, as being the person in control with the man who can't be named. When they were chatting on the phone, she seemed to be the dominant one. That's the impression she got.
Yeah.
But again, it wasn't made clear, so we don't really know, but there is a wider story there to some extent, about, the motive in a way seems strange. If somebody owed €70,000, which is the figure that was mentioned in court, you're not going to get away with killing, one person, and then when he turns up unexpectedly with his pal and you kill him as well. The idea of trying to get away with, a double murder, when it's, lots of people know that this person is on the way, and and had already, the day before Eoin was killed, had called to the Symes' house and had a chat with Jay Symes, and it wasn't particularly. How would you say? It wasn't intimidating. It wasn't necessarily an animated conversation, which we heard from a witness. So it begs questions as to why he was killed. And I suppose Anthony Keegan was killed because he went along to help his friend out. Yeah, he was there. It was mentioned in court that he was there, possibly as muscle. He was there to look after his mate, who was kind of in this situation where he was going down to collect drugs that were possibly stolen, which generated this debt. And he was the guy at the bottom of the chain who had to go and deal with it. And Anthony Keegan, of course, is not sort of known as a drug dealer in of itself. He seems to be merely just there to accompany. Yeah, they were childhood friends. I mean, the two of them knew each other from a long, they knew each other their entire lives essentially. Yeah, and and it was heard in court that he was known. His nickname was Bod, and he had his own issues with drug addiction and so on. And Eoin O'Connor had often looked after him and took him on trips with him, and legitimate trips, not necessarily involved in criminality. But when it was mentioned on some of the one of the phone texts that was found on his phone. Yeah. There was a reply from Anthony when he had said that he was going down to Cavan, and he says, "I'm going with you." There was no, "Do you want me to go with you?" or do you think you'd be all right? It was, "I'm going with you." So he was a loyal friend, and Margaret, his sister, had actually used those words. And to think that in a way, it was that loyalty that ended up being, causing his death. But just the whole, I suppose the whole nature of their death and everything just left them, in a terrible situation. I mean, Margaret, again, in her victim impact statement, and she talked about she was fixated with having scented candles at the funerals because she was told that the body bag in the coffin had to remain shut. Yeah. Because in case there was a smell, the bodies were decomposed. We heard in graphic detail, and as did the families, of the state of the bodies when they were retrieved almost a month later, off the island. And in fact, it was the smell of the bodies that at first, attracted the Garda to search that island. The fishermen out had noticed it downwind. So that'll give you a sense, I suppose, of just of the horrors the family have to hearing this, and to learn this and deal with it, and then know, and for this to go on for 11 and a half years, it's a long time where you're dealing with these kind of this imagery and this the thought of some, did they feel fear? Who died first? And what were they thinking? Before they died? It's an awful kind of situation to be in. Now, obviously, as you said, it's gone on 11 years, but it may again come back to court because there is Ruth Lawrence's ex-partner could still face trial in this country, Neville van der Westhausen, if that's the correct pronunciation. What do we know about him and
where is he at the moment? He's currently in prison.
Well, Neville van der Westhuizen, he would have fled to South Africa, obviously, and Ruth went with him. And that would have been like very shortly afterwards. That was back in April 2014. So it wasn't until 2016, in October that year, the DPP directed the couple be charged with murder, and the arrest warrants were issued. And then it was in February 2019, he was actually involved in the murder of a teenager in Durban who supposedly had stolen a mobile phone from a tattoo parlour he was working in. Turns out this kid hadn't actually stolen the phone. There was a group of them, and they hung them up and beat them up and apparently poisoned them. And one of these guys died. Another was left with permanent injuries. So, like, they have started the situation, and it's really up to the minister. And at the moment, it was heard in court during the trial that the earliest possible date that the Irish authorities could get him would be 2027, when he is eligible for parole. But that would take a political decision in South Africa to give him parole so we could get him.
Yeah.
But otherwise, he'll be serving his time till 2035. But the fact that Ruth Lawrence was convicted really strengthens the case. If she'd been acquitted, it's quite possible the South African government would kind of say, well, why are we going to let him go when we might get him back to finish his sentence? But the fact that Ruth has been convicted of being an equal partner in this murder, looks strongly in favour of that. A political decision might be coming from the South Africans that they would let it go. And certainly one of the investigators that I kind of spoke to briefly off the record was convinced that, yes, we're definitely going to get him back.
Yeah. I mean, and he has resisted extradition as of this point, I think, anyway. He has appeared in court and said that basically Irish jails aren't safe and that they're overcrowded, which is a typical thing that people do, I suppose, and that never seems to fully work.
It's been used in every extradition hearing I've ever sat in. Now, they're not that many, maybe a dozen or 15 of them over the course of my career, but it's every single time you hear that, regardless of where they're going.
Yeah, it's the standard line. So Ruth Lawrence, she's given 2 life sentences. Now, that's a kind of an academic thing, I suppose. A life sentence is a life sentence, though obviously this is, recognition that she was involved in 2 murders. She'd presumably be taken to the Docus women's prison, which is part of the Mountjoy complex. What sort of sentence is she looking at, and what will sort of life be like in the Docus?
It's either Docus or possibly Limerick prison as well. They have a new women's wing, and there is a couple of the long-serving lifers are there. So it really depends on how she's going to get on with other inmates. I mean, at the moment, we haven't heard anything as yet. But I mean,
typically though, if you're from Dublin, they'll put you in the Docus to allow family and things.
Yeah,
like that
absolutely. Yeah. And it's really, it would only come down if there was any kind of safety threats or if she was a threat to anyone.
Yeah.
And you do find that, I mean, if she's considered, say, manipulative or a danger to other women, that she may well be moved to somewhere where it's easier to keep her isolated. I mean, she would have been on remand up to this point, so she wouldn't have been in the normal regime. So once you're sentenced to life, then you get access to education or training purposes, training. Although we did hear that she did get some training already and getting her certificate. So it sounds like, it looks like she's already on a regime and that she's not seen as a particularly problem prisoner. And I mean that in both ways. Like, she's not the focus of other problem prisoners, or she's not causing problems herself. So, I mean, if she does her time quietly, she still will be a long time in. The fact that it's a double murder, and there's no great expression of remorse, there was no apology heard in court. There's, it's going to count against her. The fact that, she's got a double sentence is certainly going to count against her. I mean, I imagine she's going to be in prison for quite a long time.
And the regime in the women's prison, is it much different than the men's? Is it harder, softer? I mean, the life sentences do tend to be slightly shorter for the women as well, don't they?
They for most of them, yeah, they have done. I mean, on average, it's like across everything, it's 22 years, but there are 2 women, like, I think, as far as I remember, approaching that at this stage. Charlotte Mulhall being one of them. I mean, she's in since 2006, so I mean, she's getting close to that kind of 20-year mark. And we have a report on the fact that she's been let out on day release, and she's had kind of escorted visits outside as well. So she's, quite possibly on the path to full release. But like in a way, like, there was an argument in her case that which she made and failed in, that it was it was self-defense.
Yeah.
Whereas Ruth Lawrence is a cold, calculated killing, and it's a different category of murder. I would say it's probably the highest level.
Yeah.
It is up there with Rose Lynch, who makes the effort they do to carry out a really planned murder. Go to the trouble of arming themselves, getting their target into the kill zone where they're going to murder them and hopefully make their getaway. So, there's a huge amount of premeditation in both those women's killings, which suggests that that'll all be taken into account. And the fact that it's a double murder as well has to count for something with the parole board.
Yes. Okay, Eamon, well, no doubt we'll come back to her maybe if we hear how she's getting on in prison, but it remains some of her motivation. It still remains kind of a mystery, really, and for a woman like that to become involved, as you said, there are other women that have been maybe helped, assisted murderers, but she is accused, and it's a state case that she actually pulled the trigger and, if not dealt a fatal blow, certainly shot somebody with the intention of killing them.
And we also, and I probably should have mentioned, we did hear evidence from Stacey Simons that, when Ruth Lawrence showed off a gun to her, she got a thrill. She said, it was whatever it was doing for her.
Yeah.
She really enjoyed handling a gun and showing it off, and was always happy to have one tucked into the waistband of her trousers. It's something her father Jay Symes said as well in his evidence. Yeah.
Well, look, it's a sad tale, and the families spoke very well. The families of the two men, and our best wishes are with them. So thanks, Eamon.
Absolutely, Niall.